Good evening. I'm John Wensky, Vice Chair of the Shrewsbury School Committee, and welcome to our meeting for Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020. Tonight's virtual meeting is being broadcast live on Selco channels 29 and 329, and streamed live on Shrewsbury Media Connections website. Thank you to SMC Executive Director Mark Serra and SPS IT Manager Brian LaRue for supporting these broadcasts. Tonight's meeting will be rebroadcast between now and our next scheduled meeting on Wednesday, July 29th. We do offer public participation during our virtual meetings. Although no one is scheduled to present today, I encourage the public to contact the school committee if you'd like to speak about specific school-related topics. Please email us in advance of our July 29th meeting. Our email address is schoolcommittee@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. Before we start tonight's meeting, I'd like to report some sad news regarding the passing of longtime Shrewsbury Media Connection TV producer, John McDonald. John was one of the pioneers of public access broadcasting in Shrewsbury, and was also a teacher in Shrewsbury Public Schools for 32 years from 1971 to 2003. In a 2016 Telegram and Gazette article written by Elaine Thompson, when asked, "What did you like most about teaching?" John McDonald said, "I enjoy seeing the accomplishments of my former students. I always encouraged them to reach for the top of the mountain, and they did. I feel that Shrewsbury has a great school system that prepared my children for college and beyond." John will be remembered by his students, staff, and colleagues fondly. I have great memories myself of John's many public access broadcasts. John produced for schools dating back to the mid-'80s. When I was in SPS public schools, watching his middle school moments programs, among others, and of course the countless broadcasts produced for Shrewsbury school committees. I'm thankful to have known John over the last 5 years and enjoyed sharing our mutual interests in broadcasting and our previous career experiences at local Worcester radio stations. John will truly be missed, and his legacy in Shrewsbury will live forever. I would like to ask my colleagues and our viewers at home to join me in a moment of silence to honor the legacy and memory of John McDonald. Thank you. Okay, our first order of business is chairperson and members reports. Colleagues, any questions or any reports, I should say? I don't see any. Okay. The next item on our agenda is Superintendents Report. Dr. Sawyer. Are you on mute?
I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Wensky, and I appreciate that eloquent tribute to Mr. John McDonald. I had the pleasure of meeting John when he was a teacher at Floral Street School the first year it opened in 1997 when I came to Shrewsbury. John was had been teaching for a number of years prior to that at Shrewsbury Middle School, and those who were here may recall that the fifth grade was moved out of the middle school into the elementary schools when Floral Street School opened because of the crowding problems the district was experiencing at that time. John, as a teacher, was always incredibly kind with his time with me. I learned a lot about the history of the Shrewsbury schools and the Shrewsbury community from my interactions with John when I was being new to the community myself at the time. After a few years, he retired, and as you mentioned, he had a very passionate second career working for Shrewsbury Media Connection, and one of his responsibilities was broadcasting the school committee meetings for many years. John was very diligent and incredibly reliable in that role, and that's something that I certainly appreciated. But certainly among all things, in addition to caring deeply about his students, as you mentioned, he certainly cared so much and was always very proud to share all of the news about his own family, his own children, and then eventually his grandchildren. He would often bring a grandson in with him on the days of school committee meetings to check in with Beth McCollum, our assistant, who would be preparing him for that evening's meeting. And I can always remember the smile on his face when he'd bring his grandson by the town hall, and really just was as a father and grandfather was so proud. So certainly on behalf of everyone in the Shrewsbury Public Schools, I want to send our condolences to John's family, and he certainly will be missed. So thank you for recognizing him this evening. Additionally, as far as superintendent's report, I did want to let the community know. You may recall that last week the school committee took some votes relative to transportation registration, that we are going to begin phasing in transportation registration without any bus fees for those families who live 2 or more miles from school as the very first cut at this, with the intent to try to provide transportation access to as many students as we can. We are told we're actually going to receive the state's guidance this evening relative to transportation, so we're looking forward to receiving that. Our IT staff has been busy creating various codes so that the registration process can work in PowerSchool. There's been a little bit of a delay relative to that. So with that, I do want to let the community know that we are expecting that by the very beginning of next week, we'll have that transportation registration access communication being sent out to families. So we'll get that out as soon as we possibly can. Similarly related to that, we have begun processing refunds for a variety of things that occurred in the spring that the school committee authorized. It's been a very time-intensive process. And I want to thank Dottie Flynn in particular from the business office for the work she's doing. We've begun cutting checks for extended school care and various other after-school program refunds. And then the refunds for bus fees will be going out probably during the first week in August. We appreciate the collaboration with the treasurer's office on this issue. And because of the volume and because of the limited staffing at Town Hall, it has been delayed a bit, but those checks will be coming out in the near future. I also want to let the community know and our staff that we have been working with our reopening task force, and the subcommittees working under that task force have been doing an enormous amount of work over the past couple of weeks. Excuse me. The key dates that are coming up: a week from this evening, we'll be presenting to the school committee an initial set of plans. We're being required by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education with presenting plans for what it would look like or what the possibilities might be for a full in-person return to school, a hybrid model or essentially an alternating schedule model where we'd have fewer students in the buildings, as well as a full remote model. And we want the school committee to give approval to what we are able to construct for a submission in advance of July 31st, the deadline that DESE has set. And then the following week, 2 weeks from this evening, our plan is that the preferred model that we would be implementing would be presented to the school committee for their approval. So the next 2 weeks will involve an enormous amount of work. Things are moving very quickly. And we appreciate the feedback we've received so far, both through the email address 2020reopen@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us, as well as the survey we recently sent to families, and as well as the internal survey for staff that staff have been completing. I really appreciate the hard work that our staff is doing on this. This is the most complex work that we have done in our careers, and by an order of magnitude. And you'll be receiving a report a little bit later about the medical information that we're reviewing to help make the best decision we can for our students and staff. I'm sure that as we continue to report out, you'll get a sense of the levels of complexity that we're dealing with. But I am confident in our team, and I'm confident that we will put the best plan forward that we possibly can for our students and staff and families. One element I did want to announce this evening to make sure that there's clear, I know we had talked about this at previous school committee meetings in the spring, in early summer, but in order, based on with some of the funding that we're receiving from the federal government through the state, and by reusing the iPads that were turned in by our 8th graders and our graduating seniors, we are going to be in a position where we will be providing a school-issued iPad to all of our students in grades kindergarten through 12 for the coming year. This will facilitate whatever model of learning we need to utilize. And of course, one of the possibilities is that we may be needing to shift back and forth between different modalities depending on how the virus evolves. We're in a very strong position right now in Massachusetts, thank goodness, but obviously we cannot predict how things are going to continue. But that is part of our plan. And I know there are a couple of questions that come up, and I want to make sure that families understand as well as our staff, that all of our students in kindergarten through grade 12 will have a school-issued digital device, an iPad, for the coming school year. And I appreciate our Director of IT, Brian LaRue, and his team for the work that they're doing to process this. And we'll be sending out some information in my email that will go out to families tomorrow, some initial information, and then we'll be providing detailed information about how we're going to issue those devices later in the summer in an upcoming communication. So I want to make sure people were aware of that. In addition, I did want to let everyone know and ask them to take a look at, we did send a link, and I'll resend it tomorrow as well, to our annual report for the calendar years 2018 and 2019. We did not have the capacity last year to do an annual report, and we were just about done with this 2-year version when the pandemic hit in March. We restarted that work, and I appreciate that under the leadership of Dr. Jane Lizotte, our Assistant Superintendent for Community Partnerships and Wellbeing, Beth McCollum, the Executive Assistant to the Superintendent, Karen Isaacson, our Director of Extended Learning, and a former employee who recently returned to town, Kim Canton, who was previously the Executive Assistant to the Superintendent, who has graphic design background, and she designed the document. It has an excellent number of vignettes from alumni, current students, current staff. It really gives the flavor of a lot of the work we're doing as a school district under our different strategic priorities. I encourage people to look at that. Additionally, the Shrewsbury School Journal. This is the edition that will be arriving in homes over the next several days. Again, I want to thank Beth McCollum for her work on this to coordinate the project, as well as Christina Luther, who is the designer that we use, who's also a Shrewsbury parent, and everyone who made contributions. There's a variety of excellent articles in it, and I encourage the public to read that when it arrives in your mailboxes this week. And then one final thing, and which is a really a piece of good news, and it's I wanted to share with the community, and it's apropos given what Mr. Wensky talked about, Mr. John McDonald talking about how he was most proud as a teacher of the accomplishments his students went on to after they left the schools. I had the privilege today to be invited to a Zoom thesis defense by a Shrewsbury High School graduate, Phil Mansfield, who was a graduate of the class of 2010, who was an astrophysics graduate student at the University of Chicago. And he presented his thesis, which was titled, very interestingly, "Why Dark Matter Halos Die Together, an Intergalactic Murder Mystery." And he did a wonderful job explaining for lay people like myself the incredible research that he's doing about dark matter in the formation of galaxies. Phil is going on to a postdoctoral research position at Stanford University next year. But in addition to presenting some really very cool research, I was also very proud that Phil also talked about the project he worked on this past year, which was to help teach a year-long high school class in physics in inner city Chicago in the Chicago Public Schools, where his responsibilities were particularly helping students understand the ideal gas law. And being a local raised here in Shrewsbury, he had the students do some pretty neat experiments determining whether or not the Patriots and Tom Brady had indeed cheated or not back in the AFC title game against the Colts a number of years ago. But the fact that he's sharing his talents and education with high school students at the same time that he's doing some groundbreaking research was really incredible. And it was a real high point during what's a very difficult time for all of us in education. It just reminded me of the promise that our students have and the ability that they have to go on and do some amazing things after they leave us here in Shrewsbury. So I wanted to recognize Phil and congratulate him on earning his PhD in astrophysics from the University of Chicago. And that is Superintendent's Report this evening.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Great report. Any comments or questions before we move on to the next item? Okay. The next item on our agenda is a time schedule appointment with regards to a gift from the Beijing Chinese Language School. Per school committee policy 911, gifts of $5,000 or more must be formally accepted by the school committee. The Massachusetts Beijing Chinese Language School would like to make an unrestricted gift of $5,000 to the Colonial Fund MBCLS also intends to donate medical masks and 2 infrared thermometers to support our school nurses' offices. MBCLS Principal Brian Hsu offered this support with the approval of his board of directors, and it exemplifies the positive long-term relationship that MBCLS and Shrewsbury Public Schools enjoy. Here to present is Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins. Any additional context you'd like to provide?
I'll just begin by saying we appreciate MBCLS's generosity. They've been generous to us before in the form of donations and scholarship funds. I know they've been also generous with the Shrewsbury Public Library. It's a very vibrant learning institution that helps Chinese American families maintain their culture, and they make a great connection with us every year in our own Mandarin Chinese classes, and so, especially during their New Year celebration. And we just deeply appreciate this very generous donation. But I'll turn it over to Mr. Collins, who also has worked with Mr. Hsu over the years as well.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. I would just echo some of those same comments that this is certainly just another example of strong bonds between 2 educational organizations. Mr. Hsu and his wife are residents of Shrewsbury. In fact, his wife, April, used to work here in the central office for a number of years. And they also, as a reminder to some school committee members, the MBCLS also made a donation back in 2016 of $5,000 to sponsor an annual scholarship to Shrewsbury High School graduating seniors. So again, we appreciate their ongoing support and recognition of our financial distress, and we certainly recommend that the school committee vote to accept this very generous gift and continue our long-term partnership.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Comments or questions? Jason?
I just wanted to echo the comments that Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins made and throw in my personal thanks to the Massachusetts Beijing Chinese Language School, which is a wonderful institution. It serves hundreds and hundreds of Shrewsbury families each year. It does a wonderful New Year's celebration each year, which I was very sad to miss due to the pandemic this year. And I want to in particular underscore that, like with a lot of private educational institutions, this has not been an easy year for the Massachusetts Beijing Chinese Language School. So I really want to underscore the value of this gift to Shrewsbury Public Schools. This is a tremendous level of support at a time when I know making gifts like this is not necessarily easy. So I just wanted to throw in my personal thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, there being none, I need to get a motion for the school committee to vote to accept the unrestricted gift of $5,000 to the Colonial Fund from the Massachusetts Beijing Chinese Language School. We have a motion.
Moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call vote. Jason?
Aye.
Dale?
Aye.
Lindsay?
Aye.
Sandy?
Aye.
Myself? Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you so much for your generosity. Appreciate it, Patrick.
Mr. Wensky, I think this was the time that I was told to remind Dr. Sawyer about just a quick update on the Colonial Fund, if he's prepared to do that at
Certainly.
this time.
Yep, absolutely. Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Wensky. And I do want to again thank the Chinese Language School for their donation. I also wanted to let the community know that we've had a variety of donations in this ongoing campaign to raise funds to the Colonial Fund, given the budget crisis that we continue to work through due to the pandemic, as well as the structural budget issue we had even prior to the pandemic. I wanted to mention in particular 2 students who have recently been inspired to help the Colonial Fund through their own fundraisers. Leah Ryder is a student at Shrewsbury High School who created something called Shrewsbury Smart Cookies, which is she and 11 other student bakers are taking requests for various sweet treats they're making and delivering personally. And she was recently highlighted in an article in the Community Advocate, so thank you to Leah for that. And also 8th grader Nathaniel Robinson has been helping his family not only clean out their garage, but also hosting a yard sale every Tuesday from 4 to 7 p.m. At their home at 29 High Street in Shrewsbury, where they're selling equipment from the family's recently closed business, as well as different household items. And they are making donations to the Colonial Fund from proceeds as well. So wanted to, you can find more information about those students as well as the overall campaign on our website. But we're linking to that through our community bulletin that goes out each week, and it's also found if you go onto our main website and scroll down, there's a Colonial Fund link near the bottom there. So, or if you Google Shrewsbury Public Schools Colonial Fund, it will also come up. At this point, I want to report that so far we've had over 225 donors who have donated $57,873 so far as part of this campaign. And every one of those dollars is important and will be utilized effectively, some way to help students with innovative learning in the coming year as we look to replace funds that we're losing as a result of a variety of issues with our budget. So thank you again to everyone who's made a donation. Thank you to Leah and her other fellow bakers, and to Nathaniel for their support. If anyone, we certainly appreciate the community's generosity. So thank you for allowing me to provide this brief update.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Our next item on the agenda is a time scheduled appointment with regards to a presentation on the medical information regarding COVID-19. Dr. Timothy Gibson, who's the SPS school physician, and Noel Freeman, who's our director of nursing, will make a presentation with regards to COVID-19 in order to provide the school committee and the public with context that is informing the school district's ongoing planning for the reopening of schools. So with that, Ms. Freeman and Dr. Gibson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Wensky. I think Dr. Sawyer is going to share our slides. So as he gets that up and running, I will just again introduce myself. I am the Director of School Nursing, and I'm fortunate to have presenting with me tonight Dr. Timothy Gibson, who, as you said, is our school physician. Dr. Gibson is a pediatric hospitalist at UMass Memorial Medical Center, and he really is a wealth of information for my nurses and myself throughout the school year. And I'm so happy to have him here as a resource for the community with me this evening. So you'll hear from Dr. Gibson in a few minutes. For now, I'd like to start off by sharing the key messages, which are typically shared by Dr. Sawyer at school committee meetings. I have the pleasure of sharing these tonight as they relate so closely to the health and safety information that Dr. Gibson and I will be presenting. So our first key message is that the health and well-being of students, families, and staff is priority number one. Number two, our focus for the coming year is to develop a safe school environment for our students and staff, prioritizing everyone's well-being and enabling high levels of learning for all. And third, we are planning based on guidance from the Department of Education while closely monitoring the latest information from medical experts and the evolving data regarding the pandemic in Massachusetts and Shrewsbury. So our next slide is just a reminder for people, although probably most people in attendance do not need this reminder, that children benefit from being in school. So this quote on the screen is from the American Academy of Pediatrics COVID-19 Planning Considerations, which is guidance that was recently released by the AAP. So they remind us that schools are fundamental not only for academic instruction, but also for social and emotional skills, as a safe place for students to be during the day, a source of reliable nutrition through school meals, various therapies from physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and of course, mental health services. There's also opportunities for physical activities that might not be available for students when they are at home. And of course, there's other benefits that aren't listed here. In addition, there is the critical role in addressing racial and social inequities that we are more focused on now than ever. And again, a reminder that as we plan to develop COVID-19 policies and procedures for the coming year, we need to consider the possible negative effects of children's well-being if they are not in school. So with this frame of reference, I'd like to pass things over to Dr. Gibson, who will review the information that we've received recently from the Department of Education and explain a little bit about how that relates to our work.
All right. Thank you, Noelle. So just to introduce myself again, I'm Tim Gibson. I'm one of the pediatric hospitalists at UMass. And I've been at UMass since 1995, starting there as a student. And so I've gotten to know all of the community docs, and I know all the infectious disease docs and the epidemiologists at UMass. So I feel like that's one of the things that I've been able to bring to my position at Shrewsbury is connections with the specialists at UMass, the infectious disease specialists primarily, and who can help us along when thinking about guidelines and the medical science behind the guidelines that are coming out. So when this hit in the spring, there was sort of a mad rush and it was happening quickly. And remember talking to Noelle, and there had been a conference call where it was recommended that schools not shut down. And this was a sort of a statewide conference call amongst superintendents. And immediately after the call, this town decided they were going to shut down, and then this town decided they were going to shut down, and then town said, well, how can we not shut down? We're surrounded by towns who are all shutting down. And it became clear that for reopening guidelines, that kind of chaos was not going to be optimal. And we needed more guidance from the state so that each town didn't have to recreate the wheel with guidance and do all the research on their own. Instead, we could leave the research to a larger body with experts that could come up with recommendations for the entire state. So DESE put out their initial guidance in June of this year, and as Noelle pointed out, the three options were to bring all kids back part-time, or not bring kids back at all and do all of our learning remotely. And the DESE's guidelines strongly advise to bring kids back to school in person. That's our number one priority, but to do it safely. And the members of the committee that put out the guidelines, it's epidemiologists, it's pediatricians. If you guys could just hold on 1 second, my son's baseball game just ended. All right, sorry about that. So a panel of experts got together and they reviewed the literature, and the quotes that I have in bold terms here are quotes that come directly from that initial document from DESE in June. When they look at the literature, at least the literature that existed in June, it became clear that transmission in schools is much less likely than transmission in other settings. We know that children in general, and maybe a 17-year-old is closer to an adult than a child, but children in general do not get coronavirus. We have not seen a single case of a sick child with coronavirus symptoms at UMass since March. Now, we've seen a couple of these post-coronavirus MISC with the inflammation of the coronary arteries. So that we know that those kids had coronavirus, but we have not admitted one sick child with coronavirus during our time. And we stayed open the entire time. Other pediatric hospitals closed. Mass General closed so that they could use their floor for adult patients. We did not, and we stayed open. So had there been sick coronavirus children, we would have seen them, and we just did not see them. And then, so, anecdotally, we can feel better about that. But in addition to anecdotes, the committee that came up with the initial DESE guidelines looked at studies across the world about transmission of coronavirus in schools. If you want to go to the next slide. So each of these should have been bolded. Each of these slides is accompanied in the guideline by a reference to a study somewhere in the world. And there were studies from Australia and Singapore and Ireland and France. We know that kids are less likely to get it. They're less likely to transmit it. Even when exposed to others who have it, they're less likely to get it. And when they have it, they're less likely to get sick. And so these things combined with the successes that the state of Massachusetts has had in controlling the coronavirus has led DESE to recommend that all kids come back to school with caveats. So next slide. So this is what they came up with for guidelines. And of course, at the end of these guidelines, there were left a whole bunch of questions that we knew were going to need to be answered before opening schools. But the initial guidelines said all children should come back in person if it can be done safely. They all need to wear masks, and the guidelines suggested that they be mandatory for grade 2 and above. And then, some webinars that Noel and I have been to suggested that kids even younger may be able to do that. And there are almost no medical exceptions to the ability to wear a mask. Asthma does not prevent you from wearing a mask. Having heart disease doesn't prevent you from wearing a mask. Having a facial abnormality does not prevent you from wearing a mask. So these are all things that we're all doing in everyday life anyways. Masks, social distancing, and hand washing. So the DESE guidelines propose that kids sanitize their hands upon arrival at school and then frequently through the day, especially when taking their mask off or eating. And then social distancing. So we all know about the 6 foot rule. The DESE guidelines said try for 6, but 3 feet is acceptable if um, students are wearing masks. And just through this whole coronavirus epidemic, the first is that we continue to learn things every day. Is it droplet? Is it airborne? The thought initially, and really to this point, is that coronavirus is spread via droplets. And we all learn in medical school the rule of transmission for droplets. You need to be within 3 feet of the patient for more than 15 minutes without a mask. And we had sort of a meningitis scare in the Shrewsbury school systems, maybe, I don't know, a year ago, a year and a half ago. And the most common bacteria to cause bacterial meningitis is transmitted via droplets, and we prophylax students who are within 3 feet for more than 15 minutes. But so there's been some angst about, well, they said 6, but now it's 3. So which one is it? I just keep going back to what I learned in medical school and what infectious disease specialists have told me for my entire career: 3 feet for more than 15 minutes without a mask. So if you have a mask on, even less likely. And then the guidelines also went into other proposed changes in the school day that may decrease the number of students that each child is exposed to. And this is something that I'm sure the Dr. Sawyer and the principals and the guidance counselors are working on, and I'm sure it is a tremendous job to try to tackle. But having teachers rotate classes instead of students, so they're not passing each other, having students stay together through the day instead of having 19 different kids in your class in Spanish and 20 different kids in your class in math. Try to have as many kids as possible stay together through the day, so that in aggregate, each student is exposed to fewer people through the day. So these were the initial guidelines. And then as the Shrewsbury nurses went through things, they said, okay, well, what if this happens? Well, what if this happens? And so the Mass chapter of the Academy of Pediatrics put on a webinar that was hosted by Lloyd Fisher, who is a pediatrician locally. I forget what town he works for, but he works at Reliant as a primary care pediatrician. He was a UMass resident. You know, I supervised him as a resident, and he is a friend of mine. And so we kind of have his ear. And so he hosted this webinar, and at the webinar were several pediatricians, several developmental pediatricians, some epidemiologists, and an infectious disease doctor. And the crux of that webinar was to go over these guidelines, but also to say, you know, there was some question and answering at the end. And the question was, well, what do we do if a kid is sick? What do we do, like, once they go home? When can they come back? How are they going to be tested? And the answer to all of those was DPH is going to come up with guidelines. Stay tuned. And Noel and I said, all right, well, they better come out soon. So Joe, if you go to the next slide. So just this past weekend, yep, go ahead to the next slide. Just this past weekend, DESE came out with their part 2 guidelines that gave scenarios for a whole bunch of what ifs. And Noel and I and the Sutton school nurses met with a group of local pediatricians that are primary care doctors from all of the major practices where kids from Shrewsbury go. So Child Health and UMass and Worcester Pediatrics, and Howard Zinman, I think, was there. And we all want to get on the same page about what do we do with kids who are sick in school? Do they need to come to the office? Do they need to be tested? And then the guidelines that came out from DESE just this past weekend, the 17th, addressed all those scenarios. So the most important part of it is stay home if you're sick. That is for students and for faculty members. And so, you know, no more toughing it out with a cold, because that could be coronavirus. Um, and if they come to school and become ill at school, they need to be sent home immediately. Go ahead to the next slide, Joe. So what are the symptoms that should prompt children or staff, I guess, to be dismissed from school? Well, any of the symptoms of coronavirus, not all of these, but any of them. We all know fever, we all know chills, we all know cough. New to this disease is loss of smell or taste, but sore throat is very common. Body aches are common. I had diarrhea a month ago for 12 hours. I called employee health and I was kind of mandated to be tested. And then in addition, headache and nasal congestion or runny nose. And in other states, they have guidelines. So we, when we had our Zoom call last week with the community pediatricians, we used the Indiana State DPH guidelines because that's what we had, and said, oh, I bet Massachusetts is going to come up with something like this. But the thought was, well, what about allergies? What about kids who have runny nose, but we know they have allergies? Do they need to be sent home? And what about kids who have anxiety and they come to the nurse frequently with headaches that we know is not a migraine or meningitis or a brain tumor, and we just send them back to school after 5 minutes of reassurance and a glass of water? So the Massachusetts guidelines say if they have headache um, and also another one of those other symptoms, or if they have runny nose and one of those other symptoms, then they need to be sent home. But really, this is going to be a lot of students. And there's going to be a lot of absenteeism this year. And so even if we go ahead with full return and bring everybody back to school, um, students are still going to be home for a significant portion, and we have to figure out how to deal with that. Next slide. So the guidelines are for students who are symptomatic to be tested if that's feasible. And after our Zoom meeting with community pediatricians last week, Noel and I have been on an active thread that's talking about testing. Where does it happen? What's the turnaround time? What are they testing for? Is it PCR, which tests for genetic material of the virus, or is it another test? How is the test obtained? Nasopharyngeal swabs are very uncomfortable. UMass in our testing tent does saliva testing. And then what's the sensitivity of the test? the specificity is very high. The sensitivity is much lower than that, about 70% sensitive. So the guidelines say that if kids are symptomatic in any way, if they're tested and they're positive, they need to be home from school for at least 10 days from the beginning of the symptoms and at least 3 days from the end of fever, if they had a fever, and at least improvement in whatever symptom prompted them to be tested in the first place. If the student decides not to be tested, that's their choice. They're home quarantined for 14 days from the beginning of their symptoms. If the student is tested and is negative, they may return to school 24 hours after the end of their symptoms. And that has caused um, some debate, amongst kind of medical personnel. Well, what about the sensitivity of the test? It's only 70%. How can we let a kid with a negative test come back to school and not have them quarantined? The answer to that is that the prevalence of coronavirus in our community right now is very low. So when the prevalence of a disease is high, a negative test is much more likely to be a false negative because there's lots of coronavirus out there. But at the prevalence where we see coronavirus now in our community, we can be assured that a negative test is likely to be a true negative test. The incidence of, or on the Massachusetts state COVID dashboard that comes out every day, they monitor what percentage of tests that are done are positive, and it's hovered between 1% and 2% for a month now. And those are really great metrics, and that's one of the most important metrics that the state is following. And if any of you look at the dashboard, they have sort of green, yellow, and red with the 4 to 5 major metrics that they're following. And this is a metric that's been in the green for many weeks now. So and then the question, the asterisk there is if they're negative, do they require documentation from a healthcare provider to return to school? So this is one of the concerns for the healthcare providers, that they're going to be overwhelmed asking for tests. And most kids who are mildly ill don't need to come into their office. And if they have COVID, then pediatricians don't want them in their office because they don't want them to spread it. And so pediatricians are stressed about UMass's proposal to close the testing tent because that's the most efficient testing model now. You don't even get out of your car. They test you right in your car. So there's still some tweaking that needs to be done here and some specifics to questions that need to be answered. But as of now, these are the guidelines for what to do with sick patients. Next slide. So then in addition, DESE came out with guidelines about what to do for close contacts of positive cases. And the guidelines say schools should work with their local departments of public health and Massachusetts contact tracers to determine who is a close contact. It's certainly not everybody in the whole school. It may not be everybody in the whole class. It certainly is the students that sit within 3 feet of them. But though that is a question that we still need to have answered. I mean, if one patient or one student is positive and the entire class needs to be out and be tested, what happens to to that class? Does that become remote for the 10 to 14 days that it's going to take? But the guidelines are the same. If those close contacts are tested and they're negative, they may return to school as long as they're asymptomatic. As long as the prevalence of coronavirus remains at the low level in Massachusetts that it is now. And then the last guideline, I think this is on the last slide. I think the next one might be our last slide. The last guideline is what schools should do if there's an outbreak of coronavirus in a class. Are there several in a class? Are there several in a school? What is defined as an outbreak? How big an outbreak is big enough to consider closing a school or a district for 1 to 3 days? The guidelines from DESE that came out this past weekend said it's a consideration, but none of that should be decided without input from departments of public health. So we, so just in conclusion, we're in a good place. The literature as of now supports that transmission in schools is quite low. You know, there were some studies that came out this week that suggested that maybe older kids are much more likely to transmit it. And I don't think anybody's surprised by that, because a 17-year-old might be closer to an adult than a 3-year-old, or closer to how coronavirus acts in adults than how coronavirus acts in 3, 4, 5, 7-year-olds. We know that those young kids just don't get sick. Um, so we can be reassured by the literature. We can be very reassured by what's happened in Massachusetts and how well we've controlled the virus. I was reading on Boston.com just before speaking how the country is really looking to us as a model for success in controlling the virus. We had it bad at the beginning, but we've been really a success story in controlling it. I think because people are more likely to trust in the science here and believe in masks and not make a big deal about it. I mean, it's not the biggest deal in the world. I'd rather not do it, but it's not the biggest deal if I have to do it. And then we have great guidance from DESE, and they are using the medical literature and experts in the field to help write their guidelines. As with any guideline, it's just a guideline, so we can deviate from them. But as of now, those are the guidelines, and you know, Noel and I will keep an eye on any updates that come out, and of course, all of this is subject to change if there's an outbreak. But as of this moment, we're really in a good place, and that's why the guidelines are recommending that we try to bring every child back in person if possible. Ooh, I turned off my video.
Thanks, Dr. Gibson. If you can, yep, we'll move on to the next slide. So Tim referred to some of this research. Just want to highlight again that the tracking of both local and state data combined with our continual review of the ever-evolving body of research is what is going to guide our decision and the development of Shrewsbury-specific policies and procedures. So just quickly, the images on this slide are just a few examples of recent information that's kind of come across our desks or our screens, if you will, in the last week. So in the bottom left corner, Dr. Sawyer recently requested new up-to-date statistics from the Department of Public Health for the town of Shrewsbury. So as you can see, as of July 17th, 3.9% of the cases in Shrewsbury were in U19 and under. That equates to 13 out of 332 cases. So a really low number of school-age kids have tested positive. In the middle of the screen is the study that Tim referred to about students or kids ages 10 to 19 possibly spreading the virus in ways similar to adults. It's a study that came out of South Korea, and that was just released on Saturday from various news outlets. And then the other corner is actually a study that just came to my attention in a meeting that we were at 4 o'clock today. So this represents a couple of hairstylists out in Illinois who were seeing customers, clients, and both of the hairstylists were wearing face masks, as were, I think, their customers. And the hairstylists were each symptomatic for several days, got tested and tested positive, but during that time they continued to see clients. Between them, they saw 139 clients, and none of those clients tested positive for COVID-19. And that just really highlights the importance of mask wearing in the prevention of the virus. So that's all to say that there truly is new information available every day to us. We're doing our best to keep up to date with it and factor the medical science into our thinking as we move forward in the process. The next final slide just highlights that in addition to the data and research that we're reviewing, of course, input from our stakeholders is equally as important to guide our thinking and decision making. To that end, we've done a couple of things to date, and we'll continue to gather feedback as the process continues. So far, Dr. Sawyer reported out last week on the initial survey of parent preferences that he sent out regarding return to school. And there are plans to solicit additional student-specific feedback as more district-specific plans are determined. And then a survey form was released last week as well to all staff. It's really a forum for questions, concerns, ideas about reopening that answer the questions. The data will be shared with the various subcommittees of the reopening task force. The survey, like I said, was released last week. It already has several hundred responses. And I just want to remind staff that it will be open, continue to stay open through the middle of August. And it's a place that they can go back to as many times as they would like as they think of questions to get that information to the teams that are making decisions. So that is all for Tim and I tonight. I do just want to specifically thank Tim for his role in really conceptualizing and initiating the collaboration with local pediatricians. I feel like this is something that will really benefit not only the physicians and school nurses, but also the families in being able to really have a consistent approach to all of this as we move forward. So I thank Tim for getting that started and involving us in it. So if you have any questions for us, we will do our best to answer them.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Dr. Gibson, thank you very much as well. Colleagues, any questions or comments? Dale, Dr. McGee, sorry.
A lot. So I just want to focus a little bit on the gap between when someone has symptoms in school, is sent home, gets tested, and then we find a result. In that gap, we have students who are staying in school yet have been considered contacts of that individual. And once that individual tests positive, they will be required to be tested and isolated and the like. So we have that gap, and it becomes very important to get accurate results and to get them as quickly as possible. And I just wonder whether we can have, as part of the registration process, a release that would allow the labs to send the lab results to the school system as well as to the ordering physician. Most laboratory requisitions will have spaces for who to send the report to. And that may be one way around that. The path that's outlined in the DESE guidance is that we let the Department of Public Health know. It doesn't necessarily say that the Department of Public Health, when they find out about a case, is going to let us know. And I would not take that as a given at all. I would try to very clearly understand whether they are going to inform us. The usual path is the lab result goes to the state enters the data, they inform the local Department of Public Health, and the local Department of Public Health attempts to trace contacts. The school system should be a big part of that contact tracing because we know where those contacts sit. And so I think it's very legitimate to include us in that loop right up front. With that being said, the path to Boston and the Mass Department of Public Health back to Worcester and the like could take weeks. And so having the lab send the lab work directly to the school system makes a lot of sense to me. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would wonder about sort of HIPAA issues with that. But I think
with the records release, there is no HIPAA issue. And I would also say that there are exceptions within the HIPAA law dealing specifically with public health. And this is clearly a public health issue.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's in the student's interest to report the results of the test to the school. And in the DPI guidelines that came out this past weekend, they did, there were a whole bunch of smaller points that they made, and contact tracing was one of the points, just like you said. Each class should keep a log of where students sit and have students sit in the same place every day, so that if there is a positive case, that we can contact trace more effectively. So you're right. I mean, there's no better contact tracers than teachers, if kids are in school. So I think that especially for parents who work and need to get their kids back to school, if they're symptomatic and they're tested and negative, they can go back as soon as they're not symptomatic anymore, which might be one day, versus if they're positive, they're out for at least 10 days from the beginning of the symptoms. And we hope that means 10 days, such that they weren't symptomatic for several days in school already. And they need to be fever-free for 3 days. So it will be in the family's best interest to also report the results of the testing to us. But yeah, I mean, I hadn't considered how does the school find out the results of testing, and maybe we need to work on a protocol for that.
Yeah, I would ask that we consider the possibility of having a records release and finding ways to automate having a copy of the lab work. I would ask also that we not have a parent call and say, I had my child tested and they're negative, and that be considered adequate. I believe we need a written report. And,
Yes.
And thirdly, I would ask that we contact the Worcester DPH and have a very clear understanding with them as to the flow of information, the expectation being that they would let us know as well as us letting them know.
Yes, so I can speak to that a little bit, Dr. McGee. We have very open lines of communication with Pat Bruckman, the lead nurse, public health nurse. And I actually just had a conversation with her a couple weeks ago in anticipation of in-person summer program opening, to say just that we will have people in our buildings. We need to, I need to make sure that any test results that they're getting back that relate in any way to the schools, whether it be a student, a staff person, that they inform us as soon as possible, which they do. I
Excellent.
have always had great luck with her doing that, and they are an excellent resource as well for when there's kind of complicated situations with different cases, as a resource to kind of sort through what the quarantine period needs to be, or when it's okay for someone to come out of isolation, those sorts of things. I think your idea of the release for lab results is very interesting. It's something that we would have to look into, and then it's because the lab tests are being ordered by the physicians. We would need the physicians to know that they can put the school on the form, right? So I feel like it's a multi-step process that.
You're in communication with the pediatricians, though, so I'm assuming that there would be some receptivity. I guess the other piece that is here is Dr. Gibson was saying that people were concerned that UMass was closing that drive-through program. And it seems that with the opening of school and probably, 40,000 students going back to elementary and secondary school, the demand for this is going to be substantial. And the operationalizing of it would be simplified a great deal if they were to open or reopen that facility. It certainly would make the communications piece with the schools easier if we had one place to send students.
Yeah.
Um,
I know,
and for
Dr.
what it's worth, organizations like UMass have an obligation to provide a measurable benefit to the community outside of the healthcare they deliver, and they might be able to get some points in their report regarding their community benefit.
Right. I know Dr. Lloyd Fisher, who's the incoming AAP chair in Massachusetts, is part of this conversation, and one of his concerns that he's expressed in emails is the access to testing. So he's very much advocating for that as well, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very important piece in our keeping kids safe in school. So.
Thanks.
Right, especially since the DPI guidelines that came out stress testing so heavily. I mean, maybe that wasn't anticipated, but now that those guidelines have come out, you're right, Dr. McGee. I mean, there's going to be a huge demand for testing.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that we have the capacity to do it. So I know Lloyd was planning to speak directly with Eric Dixon about this and stress the importance of it.
Well, if he needs somebody to sign his petition, he can sign us up.
Yeah.
Ms. Heffernan.
I wanted just to appreciate the presentation, but also the incredible amount of work that you have been putting into this for months on end. Clearly, the number of experts you've been talking with, beyond obviously the expertise that you bring to this, but in addition, the involvement of all of our community partners. I mean, you rattled off the pediatricians that cover the vast majority of the young people in our community. So it's great to know that they're part of this conversation. My first question was also about access to testing. So I thank Dr. McGee for covering it. Clearly a huge issue. And I used the UMass drive-through already for my family at one point. It was easy and it was a huge benefit. And I had my results for my whole family in 7 hours. So that's the kind of turnaround that we need to make sure that we know is that student coming back to that seat tomorrow or 3 days, 7 days. So thank you for pushing that. I guess I would wonder what you might say to, given some of these gaps that we're talking about. Particularly, I've heard a lot of in the community about concerns for kids going back to school and kids not being as vulnerable for all the reasons you've mentioned. But if they live with somebody in their family who is of a more vulnerable medical status, and I'm hearing a lot about it. I just love to hear the perspective of either you, Dr. Gibson, or Ms. Freeman, and tell us what should we be saying to those folks? Because if the kids aren't as likely to get infected, but they're moving around more, they're now in the community, they're maybe on buses and other such things, what you might say to those families that are trying to figure out what should we do?
Yeah, I mean, the guidelines talk more or mostly about transmission from child to child. Some of the studies that were referenced in the initial guidelines that came out in June did talk about the likelihood of transmission from a child in a school to a teacher. And even that incidence was quite low. But for sure, I can understand, and Noelle and I have talked about this, the hesitance of teachers to come back, especially if they're older or have a chronic condition such as diabetes or heart disease. They may be at greater risk. And so we haven't discussed at length what to do if teachers decide that they don't want to come back for medical reasons. But I think your concern is a valid one, and I think that's a valid concern, that kids may get it, be asymptomatic, but bring it home to family members. So that will be the importance of masking, hand sanitizing, and as much social distancing as possible.
So can I follow up?
Yes.
I guess it continues to be important then that all of the other rules that are in place around social distancing, if the kids start to get on the yellow school bus and come to school, then when they get home to their neighborhoods, just as we were concerned early on in the pandemic that kids were hanging out in parking lots and other such things, that they continue to follow all of those protocols, and that it's not we let down all of our guard. and when you're in school, you put on a mask. It's that you do all of that as you continue in the community. And it seems that will continue to bear a lot of repeating.
Absolutely. I think we have to take the we're all in this together approach to this, and exactly that. Parents have to recognize that this is not all up to school. Being in school will be a big step and a big change for people, but all of the other precautions that have, like Tim said, gotten Massachusetts from kind of a crisis point to a much better place with the virus. That has happened because so many people have followed the recommendations for precautions. So we need to keep that in place in order to keep the virus at bay. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that it does bear repeating.
Mr. Palich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank Dr. Gibson and Ms. Freeman for their presentation. A question and a comment. I'll start with a question, and it was alluded to a minute ago, but obviously concern for the safety of students is always the top concern for everyone who has anything to do with Shrewsbury Public Schools, but a question with regard to the safety of staff, which is also very important to district leadership. This is an unusual situation in that something that is potentially not particularly harmful to children is potentially more dangerous to adults. Obviously, we have a situation where the evidence seems to suggest that kids may be less likely to transmit or to be symptomatic, whereas with adults, that's not necessarily the case. So understanding that this is still an ongoing process, can you comment a little bit on the interplay between the notification system we're looking at for students and the teaching or adult staff in the room? In other words, if a student is known to have become infected, what type of information is going to be given to adult staff? I'm assuming an effort will be made to determine which adult staff were in contact with that student. Do we have a sense of what advice is going to be provided to those staff members?
Absolutely. So staff would be part of contact tracing, just like the other students in the room. Any notification of a positive case would not identify the student as part of just privacy. So, we wouldn't say your student Jason tested positive today. We would say one of your students or a student that you were in close contact with has tested positive. So the recommendation is that you be tested, and you'll need to quarantine at this point as a close contact until we have more information. So staff would most definitely get the same information as quickly as we have it available to us. And the same goes for if a staff were to test positive, the same process would be followed for students or other staff members who they had come in contact with. Again, not identifying someone by name, but just the general, you came in contact with someone. Not to say that by process of elimination, sometimes people are identified, but that wouldn't come directly from us. So, and I do just want to, as far as, concern about people's exposure, I think that as the district is able to release, comes to the decision and releases the information about the plan for return to school, individuals are going to have to also use the information available to them and make the decision that is best for either their student or themselves as a staff person. And there are processes in place to let us know if there's a reason that they feel that coming back into school isn't safe for them.
Thank you. And a comment, Mr. Chair, if I may, just broadly about this, and this is probably less for my colleagues than for the broader community. I have every confidence in our district leadership team, and especially Ms. Freeman and Dr. Gibson, and I want to thank you again for the work that you're doing. I have to say, this is entering my 7th year on the committee, and this is probably one of the most jarring conversations we've ever had. It is very rare that we are having a discussion about putting in place an entirely new system to deal with something that has the potential to impact the immediate health of staff and students. And I want to emphasize to the community that this is a process that they're watching play out. We don't have all the answers here. This is something we have a very dedicated team of professionals working very hard. There are a lot of questions left to be answered, and I do not envy Ms. Freeman or Dr. Gibson or anybody on your team or our central office leadership team for the number of questions you're going to need to answer over the coming weeks. I know that we've got members of the community who are looking for comfort right now, and we can't offer that yet. We have to deal with logistics first. And there are still questions that need to be answered. There are still questions that have not been answered, and this is going to be a process. And for anyone who's watching and feeling perhaps a bit uncomfortable, I just want to say that again, in my 7 years on this committee, we've never had to have a conversation like this. And it is particularly unsettling, but I want to reiterate the faith that I have in the leadership team we have in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Dr. McKee, did you have?
Well, there are a couple of things. I think one thing that's worth mentioning is that there's a lot of concern in the community. There are lots of ways for people to hear rumors or get information that may not be correct. And one expert that I heard last week said epidemiology is about a numerator and a denominator, but when you're dealing with children, it's just about the numerator. And you need to be able to prepare yourself to deal with the fact that has been a child that is infected, there's been a child that is out or whatever. And so I wonder how we intend to deal with this information from a point of view of relating to the public. Will there be information regarding we've not had any cases, or we've had one and the child is doing okay, or how do we deal with it?
It's an excellent question. That is something that we don't have a specific plan in place for as far as notifying. I think when this closure first began back in March, Dr. Sawyer did include updates of numbers in the district. Fortunately, that number stayed at 0, and included numbers in the town. So my thought would be that we would continue to do that. Again, we have to be very careful about not giving any identifying information. So it would probably be district-wide data that was shared versus building specific or anything more specific than the whole district. But I don't see a reason why we wouldn't supply that level of data to people to keep them informed.
Follow up, Dale? Oh, you're on mute. Mute.
If my memory serves me correctly, the DESE advice also threw in the fact that the observation is that it appears to be that the risk of transmission is lower outdoors than indoors. And there might have been something in there about opening windows in buses, opening windows in classrooms. Do you intend to incorporate that into your plan, or not?
So Dr. Sawyer is welcome to jump in here if you'd like, but I believe that there is a possibility of having some consultant work done around that kind of thing in the district, but it hasn't been solidified yet. So, but that is part of our thinking. It's, a question, it's in the DESE guidance, and it's a question that's been asked by various organizations like the MTA. So it is something that we're considering.
Thanks a lot.
And I can also just add, Dr. McGee, that Mr. Collins has already been in communication with the Public Buildings Department relative to various elements of HVAC, and all of our schools are in different places, of course, depending on their age and their systems. But certainly everything I'm seeing in the guidance is that fresh air is a positive, and certainly during the better weather months when we return to school, utilizing the outdoors part of the campus as much as we can, utilizing open windows, utilizing, I was on a call this afternoon that Ms. Freeman was also on, where we're expecting some expert guidance from a consulting organization that the School Superintendents Association has engaged with relative to ventilation and the like, airflow and the rest of it. So again, just like everything else, we're seeking out expert opinion, and we will endeavor to follow whatever protocols are being advised to the greatest extent that we can. I don't know if Mr. Collins wants to add anything beyond that.
Sure, I'll just add that I've been in conversation with our school transportation vendor, both the terminal manager and the owner of the company, and they are ready to respond to not only the Mass Department of Education guidance that we're hoping gets published tonight, more specifically about school transportation, but also to respond to district-specific requests for things like, just like you mentioned, about keeping bus windows open, weather permitting.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions, colleagues? I'll just say from my perspective, there's a lot of information here to digest. I do have the utmost confidence in leadership. I would ask for the public's patience. Certainly, the playbook for this chapter is still being written. So it is a challenge. I know certainly I've talked to many parents over the last week or so, but definitely the safety is priority one. We've said that, many weeks over the last 4 months. So definitely appreciate the presentation, Ms. Freeman, Dr. Gibson. I think one other thing from my perspective, and I know it's more scenario related, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this in the coming weeks, but with regards to Dr. Gibson's reference on managing through significant absenteeism based on symptoms and parents keeping their students home out of an abundance of caution, thinking through about whatever various models we have to consider, whether or not there could be a fallback if a student's in class and is symptomatic, or their parents want to keep them home, can they fall back to remote learning? Obviously not a question that we can answer here, I don't think, but just things that were on my mind as I was listening to the presentation. So Dr. Sawyer, any other additional comments?
I just want to thank Ms. Freeman and Dr. Gibson for the very thorough report and for the conversation. In the key messages, we do state that we are trying to prioritize the health and well-being of everyone, and we're being true to our word that we are closely monitoring the latest information in medical science as closely as we possibly can, and looking for that expertise to help guide our decision making, with the understanding that, as was referenced earlier, I think Dr. McGee referenced, there legitimately, of course, are a variety of concerns that different families and staff have. And as I think we all know in our experience during the pandemic, that there is a range of opinion with regard to how to address things, how closely people might follow different kinds of guidance, and how strictly. We're very fortunate that we're in a good place in Massachusetts right now, and within Massachusetts, Worcester County and Shrewsbury is in a very good place. The daily dashboard that comes out that I would encourage people to look at on the state website every day, the government website for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. What really struck me is that they list the number of hospitalizations for COVID that day and how many are in the ICU. And right now there are literally just a handful of individuals in the hospital at both St. Vincent's and both UMass campuses with COVID. I was surprised with how low the number was. I think a lot of us are being influenced by the unfortunate reality that the coronavirus is spiking in lots of places across the country. And I think that gives a context that rightfully makes people concerned about a resurgence. So as Governor Baker has said, as lots of people have said, doctors and I know public health officials, this is not the time to let our guard down. This is not the time to ease up on the restrictions that are in place and that are expected of us as good community members. And hopefully the numbers will continue to be very, very low, and that will certainly facilitate the ability for us to be confident in having some level of in-person schooling in the coming fall. So with that, again, I thank Ms. Freeman and Dr. Gibson, and I thank the committee for their thoughtful questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Thank you, Dr. Gibson and Ms. Freeman. Okay. The next item on our agenda is a time-scheduled appointment. Mr. Collins and Dr. Sawyer will present their final FY21 School Department appropriated budget recommendation for school committee vote. With that, Dr. Sawyer, Mr. Collins.
Sure, I'll start, Mr. Winsky, just with a brief overview. This evening, we're asking the school committee to actually vote to provide a recommendation to town meeting for the fiscal year 2021 budget. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that fiscal year 2021 started on July 1st. In any recent history, town meeting had never been postponed to this late date, and right now it's scheduled for August 8th. So we've been operating on the fact that the state has allowed for municipalities to work off so-called 1/12 budgets to match the amount of spending that would have happened last July, for example, to allow to utilize budget resources this July without a final budget being yet in place. The school committee budget process began back in October, I think it was. So this has been a particularly long saga this year. We had an unfortunate situation due to our structural situation where we had an existing significant budget gap that when the pandemic hit, we had made plans to close with some recommended reductions. Those reductions ultimately the school committee did make once we started to get back into the budget process back in June, I believe it was. And we have cut approximately $1.9 million from the original budget that I filed in January, because we knew that the resources would not be there. And certainly once the pandemic happened and other cost pressures became and less revenue became apparent, we knew there was no possible way for us to meet that. That 1.9 million also of reductions involved about 30 full-time equivalent staff positions, either in reduced hours, but mostly positions just removed and cut from the program. We did that through attrition as much as we could, although we did have some individuals who experienced layoffs as a result, which were very sad that had to happen to some of our employees. And one thing that I think it's important to mention to the public and to our staff who are watching is that the school committee has been particularly focused on trying to navigate the rest of this budget without any further cuts to staff. I think the loyalty to our staff, the recognition of their value, and of course, the fact that we're heading into a reopening phase where we need as many staff members on deck as we possibly can. Unlike the decision that some school districts made to lay people off back in June, based on the anticipated state aid numbers that may be being cut back based on projections, I think the school committee has held steady, and I think that's been to the benefit so that we can try to preserve as many staff as we possibly can. As we go through the presentation, we'll discuss some of the ways that we're hoping to make sure that we can preserve our staff from this point forward, if at all possible. So before I turn it over to Mr. Collins, I think I would just also add that, just so it's clear, this is another different scenario this year, is that the bottom line budget, which I'm recommending that you approve this evening to recommend to town meeting, that we have a spending plan that is actually about $400,000 more than that. And there's another about $1.5 million in revenue loss that we're currently projecting due to COVID. We will need to meet that bottom line budget. And you'll see that we're talking about taking an approach of balanced risk, where we're going to have this bottom line, but starting the year with a spending plan that's greater than that, and not adjusting downward with any cuts unless until we have a finalized state budget and we know what that number is, and we're very hopeful it's going to come in higher than the current projections, which we believe there's a very good chance it will. We know in the news right now that the federal government is looking at another round of support through a stimulus package, that a lot of which would be targeted supposedly for public education across the nation, from which we may benefit from some additional revenue. And we also are in discussions right now with our labor associations, our teacher and administrator associations, relative to potential cost mitigation, because there's no way we're going to be able to close a $2 million gap during the fiscal year without staff reductions, and that we're very much hoping to avoid. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Collins, who will provide an introduction, and we'll tag team the presentation a little bit as we move through a number of slides here.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So just a couple other points before we get into this is that this evening and on the presentation that you see and the community sees, this is pretty much at a very high level in terms of an overall budget perspective and approach, but that the school committee is recommended to take a vote at the end of this presentation on a very detailed line item budget that was not only presented initially back in January by Dr. Sawyer, but also revised and updated and sent to you separately for your review before your vote this evening. So we're not going to go through that level of detail, but try to summarize here for both you and the community. So we're going to talk about our estimating of the current budget gap that Dr. Sawyer referred to. Also our ongoing labor negotiations, which we think is a key component for making this all work next school year and providing for some cost mitigation. We're going to talk a little bit about the sequence of meaningful events and information. And unfortunately, you know, when you're making important and complex financial plans, it certainly does help when you have all the key components of information at the ready so that you can make a very precise financial plan. And unfortunately, we don't have that in this scenario. We don't have key components about what state aid is going to be, and we won't for a while. And we don't have at the ready, you know, particular fall reopening plan for school. And we certainly don't know how the virus is going to impact and couldn't forecast that for the upcoming year. So the sequence of events requires estimating and approximations, and it does every year, but this year it just has a much higher variance, if you will. As Dr. Sawyer mentioned, we believe that in this environment, that the pathway forward is so-called balanced risk, and that's in the best interest of our students, pre-K through 12, and all of our staff throughout the district as well, and our parent community. And we will just, of course, talk just briefly about the potential downside of this balanced risk approach, because it's important to know what those risks are. So in terms of estimating the current budget gap, this is as of today, of course. Our detailed operating plan post that major reduction plan that Dr. Sawyer mentioned of program and staff cuts totaling about $1.9 million. Also factoring in that the school committee earlier pre-COVID had voted to increase special revenue fees for tuition programs and school busing and athletics. And then also we know that we finished fiscal 20 with an operating surplus. All of those things kind of combined, our current revised budget plan is $67,499,696. The town manager's revised recommendation, and he's been edging upward more recently, his recommendation, which we very much appreciate given the context of our situation, his recommendation going into the August annual town meeting is $67,080,000. And so that provides still yet about a $420,000 gap in what we believe we need to operate in what he is recommending. In addition to that, we know that although we're receiving federal stimulus funds, that those funds are for COVID-related costs that are incurred up to December 30th of this calendar year, and that they cannot cover what might be so-called ordinary revenue losses. It cannot provide gaps in revenue decreases, and that was borne out in the most recent webcast on the Coronavirus Relief Fund grant from the Department of Education. So that's what leads us to believe that with the best information that we have right now, and using a series of multiple estimating models, this is just probably more of a middle ground approach, that our gap in resources is yet still just over $2 million. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Sawyer to touch on this slide.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. I mentioned earlier in my introduction that we are in ongoing labor negotiations, the school committee, with various labor unions that are part of our school department workforce. We're seeking cost mitigation through compensation adjustments, which would both decrease costs for next year, or the current year actually now, but most importantly would preserve jobs in order to maintain our educational programming and avoid further compromising learning and teaching conditions and working conditions for our staff. Without that mitigation of costs to significantly reduce that $2 million gap that Mr. Collins described, we would need to make significant further cuts to staffing at some point during the year. Another reminder that we've already cut almost 30 positions just to get to this point. And for illustrative purposes, again, for a $2 million gap, this would be an equivalency. Again, this is not the plan, but this is just the order of magnitude of what we're facing. Would be cutting about 30 teaching positions or about 78 paraprofessional positions. Again, that is not a specific plan. That just is to illustrate the number of positions that would go into reducing that kind of level of gap. In terms of additional funding from the state, I think best case scenario is probably something on the order of level funding. Town manager has projected a cut in Chapter 70, which is what happened when we had the Great Recession. And he's modeling it after that, which makes perfect sense. I do believe that there is motivation at the State House to try to protect schools as much as possible. But even if we're level funded, that would maybe, based on the amount of revenue that would likely come to the school department, maybe could reduce a little less or somewhat less than half of that $2 million gap. So again, we're looking for cost mitigation to try to preserve those working conditions and educational programming and save jobs for our employees.
In terms of the process, we're led to believe that what is typically a one-time annual town meeting event happening in May to set annual budgets for all municipal departments in the school department, that an adapted approach, given the circumstances, would have us have the annual town meeting this August 8th to set annual operating budgets for all municipal departments and the school department, so that we have a path forward for reopening schools and have some certainty about our annual appropriation. Unfortunately, as been mentioned a couple of times, we're not going to have information definitively, or maybe even a close approximation on the state budget in the subsequent state aid until later in August or maybe September, hopefully. And then once we learn that, we'll certainly see from a revenue perspective how the estimates fare up with the action at the legislative state level, and see where we are with state aid. And that the plan would be then to likely have a special town meeting in the fall, potentially in October or maybe a little bit later after the state budget is approved. That's the key piece there, so that this annual operating budget could get a second look. And this would be kind of a two-step process this year instead of just a singular set it and forget it kind of action. In that our community would then be able to react to actual state aid figures, and again, hopefully, and based upon some intent that we hear from legislators about protecting education, that there may be more revenue than currently projected, and that we could leverage that for the rest of the fiscal year through a supplemental appropriation at that special town meeting. And has been mentioned before, and I'm certain people here in their own media outlets, the possibility for additional federal stimulus funding. And so we'll just kind of have to wait and see on that. So, there are really three key levers here in summary, just to talk about the sequence of events. And Those are, as Dr. Sawyer mentioned, ongoing labor negotiations, the setting of state aid figures for our community and the school district, and then also the potential for federal stimulus aid. So, we know that certainly by the occurrence of a special town meeting sometime in October, we would have likely a lot more better information there to make further decisions on appropriations. So in terms of that sequence, we believe that this pathway of so-called balanced risk is in our best interest. Timing is a key rationale, as I mentioned before. We know that we still have this estimated gap of about $200 million between what we think we need and what is being asked for at the August 8th annual town meeting. But we think that the option of making significant reductions now in the amount of $2 million in the face of reopening schools during a pandemic is totally counterproductive. And that would be set us backwards, if you will. And we want to avoid that pathway, if you will, and then subsequently find out later that additional state aid money comes in or federal stimulus money comes in, or that we reach some sort of agreement for cost mitigation with our labor unions, and then have this, well, we had to lay a bunch of people off in August, and now we're trying to rehire. And so we're trying to avoid that. And that's what we're calling balanced risk for the next couple of months. Certainly the downside potentially is if none of those three things come forward in terms of additional state aid, cost mitigation from unions, or federal stimulus funds, then we would have to very likely make some mid-year budget reductions. Again, in the context of knowing what our modality is of providing educational services as well, because that will impact our operating costs too. So I think at this point, I would turn it back to Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. And I think that would emphasize as well, which I think may have mentioned, that there's unemployment costs that the town would have to bear as well. That would be part of the equation for the town overall budget whenever employees are laid off. So just another factor to consider. In terms of the process to move forward, annual town meeting on August 8th, tonight I am recommending that the school committee vote to support an appropriation of $67,080,000. That's the town manager's recommendation. But as you can see in italics there, it's with the understanding that the school district still needs to close a $2 million gap through the course of the fiscal year through some combination of cost mitigation and additional revenue in order to maintain our staff and our educational programming. That's the balanced risk approach we're discussing. This represents a $1.19 million increase, $1.2 million increase, a little over 1% increase over the current year. And you know that with our cost structure and overall just sort of built-in inflationary factors, a 1% budget is not going to cut it in terms of carrying forward, which is why we're in the situation we're in, already having cut $1.9 million from our budget plan. And again, we'll continue to work with our labor unions regarding cost mitigation. And we'll continue by taking this approach. We would assume a posture of balanced risk until that state budget process is completed and we know more about other issues relative to federal stimulus and the like. So that is our recommendation this evening, and we'd be happy to take any questions that the committee has at this time.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Mr. Collins, colleagues, any questions or comments? Ms. Fritz.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer, Mr. Collins. I think this is a prudent approach when we look at the budget this year. It's not like anything we've experienced. There are many unknowns, as we've talked about at multiple meetings, but this gives some certainty to open schools with staff and in place for educational services, which is our #1 priority. But it is, like we said, a balanced risk moving forward. Hopeful that those other three levers will come in our favor. Labor negotiations, we've As Dr. Sawyer mentioned, our #1 goal is to maintain as much staff and avoid layoffs. We need people in place to provide educational services. Hoping that the state aid may come in better. And again, if there's federal stimulus money, that will be directed to public schools. Hopefully not just in a manner that it has to be used by the end of the year. It's something that can be applied throughout the school year to help with this COVID crisis. So I'm fully in support of this. I think it's a well thought out plan and a prudent plan. And it also gives us the ability as we move through the fiscal year to make adjustments if need be, and hopefully we won't have to, but I think this is a very prudent and smart way to start this fiscal year. So thank you very much, Mr. Collins and Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mrs. Fritz. Mr. Palich.
Just want to echo Ms. Fritz's remarks. I also support this approach to town meeting. We lack, nor will we have in the near future, the information to determine what our financial picture will look like for the duration of the year. On the one hand, to try to cut our way all the way down to the worst possible scenario could do unnecessary harm. On the flip side, it would be just as much of a fool's errand to assume that the federal government will get its act together and come in to save state governments. So I think under the circumstances and given the number of unknowns, this is the best possible approach to town meeting.
Thank you, Jason. Any additional questions or comments? Ms. Heffernan?
Yeah, I'm also would echo my support for the.
Did Ms. Heffernan freeze for others?
We just had a big lightning strike. Like, I swear it was in my driveway. She might have been frozen.
I just heard.
Oh my God, wow.
Dr.
Sorry.
Sawyer and Ms. Heffernan appear to be frozen.
Yes.
I can't tell if Andy's frozen. Move your face in. There we go.
Dr. Sawyer.
No, I'm just saying on
Okay.
my videos thing, I think Ms. Heffernan's is frozen at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
She just texted me that they lost power.
Okay. Well, Dr. McGee, you continue.
I'll fill in while I still have power. I agree with my colleagues. I think this is a very prudent approach. I think it also highlights the fact that we're not done, that the district and the community are in a crisis, and that we will be depending on the community's concern for our school department to further fund our department as the year goes on. I think crises like this bring out the best in people. We have our non-union employees have frozen their salaries. And I think that the actions of all employees of the school department will have an effect on our appeal to the rest of the community for their generosity in the future. I think that I support this approach. We want to keep our staff intact. And I hope that everyone can set an example for the community so that during this time of crisis for the community, they will feel that they are willing to fund us further.
Thank you, Dr. McGee. If I could just make a few comments. First off, I'd like to thank Mr. Collins, not only for the presentation, but for helping us navigate through very uncharted territory when it comes to school budgeting. To me, this is like the second version of the school budget just this year. It's hard enough to navigate through a typical school budget. But this has been really helpful, the support you provided us to help us through this. As Ms. Fritz said, certainly cost mitigation is going to be key to our budget cycle right now as it pertains to, as we said, negotiations with labor unions. Ms. Fritz and I have had those meetings, certainly, and that will be key to success here in terms of cost mitigation, as well as the unpredictability, certainly, of federal stimulus funding. We know just from what we've seen from the CARES Act that there's a time-based and use-based restrictions on those dollars. So whatever might come down the road, we don't have any understanding at this point of what, if anything, will be available to us, nor do we have any visibility on what that potential funding could be used for. So I think it's important for the public to understand the unpredictability of it, as well as, what Mr. Collins highlighted in terms of these real revenue losses articulated in the presentation. $750,000 in bus fees, and certainly the activities and services fees that we depend on every school year, things that we cannot depend on this year. So definitely appreciate all the work that's been done between Dr. Sawyer, Mr. Collins, and certainly the leadership team. It's been very, very helpful. Dr. Sawyer, any additional comments?
Yes, I think that I'm going to let Ms. Heffernan is logging back in. So we're going to get her on the line here. Using her cell phone.
Yes.
Hi,
Ms. Heffernan.
Oh my goodness, and a flashlight. Sorry that we've just lost power.
That's dedication.
That was exciting. I had such
Yes.
important things to say. I literally shut down the house. Apologies to all of the members.
We're about 2 houses or 2 blocks away. I saw sparks fly out my window. So, Ms. Heffernan, you have some comments on the budget as well.
Again, apologies. Really, the point I wanted to make was just my real support for the leadership of the district and trying to figure out how to navigate these unprecedented times. The fact that we are trying to bear in mind not losing staff, and most importantly, not losing educational programming, as has been said already, is really at the forefront of our goals here. And as we heard from Dr. Gibson and Ms. Freeman, we need all hands on deck here as we reopen this fall. So I'm very much in support and appreciate the work. I hope that the rest of the town can understand the unique circumstances that we are in and why we are taking this novel approach for us, but I think keeps open the door that hopefully there are some of those levers will fall in our favor, and I am optimistic that we'll get at least some of them and can figure out the best way to reopen the schools and keep everyone safe at the same time. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Heffernan. Dr. Sawyer, go ahead.
Just in terms of again, I mean, the recommendation is clear. I appreciate the support from the committee. In terms of I was reminded, and I was remiss, I had meant to mention during Superintendents Report, we did bring students back into our schools for the first time since March this week with our special education extended year summer program for a cohort of students who really benefit from services during the summertime due to the nature of their disabilities. And it was an enormous amount of planning. And the first day when I was on site, it went very well. I'm told things continue to go well this week. And the reason they're going well is because of the staff. The combination of the leadership through the administration, Ms. Belcito and her team, along with nursing that Ms. Freeman helped put together, along with the teachers who are planning programming, the paraprofessionals who are delivering the services, the specialists who will be attending to these students' needs. It is a team effort, and I believe that this pathway really does provide us with the best chance to do the best work we possibly can this fall. Again, with the hope that by taking this calculated risk, and that's in a balanced fashion, we will be able to preserve our staff because they're what makes the difference for our students. So appreciate your support, and we'll look forward to presenting this to the Finance Committee tomorrow evening and to town meeting on August 8th with your vote this evening.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Any additional comments or questions before we go to vote? Okay, there being none, I need a motion to vote to recommend a fiscal year 2021 school department appropriation of $67,080,000 for town meeting approval.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call vote is required. Mr. Palich,
Aye.
Ms. Heffernan,
Aye.
Dr. McGee,
Aye.
Ms. Fritz,
Aye.
myself, aye. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. The minutes from the school committee meeting held on July 15th, 2020, and the school committee workshop held on July 20th, 2020 were enclosed in your packets. Any revisions to those minutes? There being none, they will be accepted as written. Okay. And I believe that is it. So we do need to go into executive session. So that is the final item on the agenda. We will need to adjourn into executive session for the purposes of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, to comply with or act under the authority of any general or special law or federal grant and aid requirements. Purpose 7, Open Meeting Law, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 22FG, for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and or releasing executive session minutes. And B, for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 21A3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation, if an open meeting may have detrimental effect of the bargaining or litigation position of the public body and the chair so declares. Purpose 3, the Shrewsbury Educational Association Unit A, Shrewsbury Education Association Unit B, the Shrewsbury Paraprofessional Association, and or the Shrewsbury Cafeteria Workers. May I have a motion to adjourn into executive session?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call vote is required. Dr. McGee?
Aye.
Ms. Heffernan?
Aye.
Mr. Palich?
Aye.
Ms. Fritz?
Aye.
Myself? Aye. Thank you and good night.